The Body Knows, Episode 15. The Body Remembers What Words Forget. Hello, and welcome back to The Body Knows. In this episode, we're stepping into something that often sits at the very edge of language, the way trauma lives in the body when words are absent, inadequate, or fail. The title of this episode borrows inspiration from Bessel van der Kolk's influential work, The Body Keeps the Score. His book opened up mainstream conversations about how trauma isn't simply a memory in the brain, but a lived reality in the nervous system. Yet, as we'll explore, van der Kolk's ideas are one thread in a much wider fabric. There are alternative perspectives, skeptical voices, philosophical critiques, and spiritual frameworks that also speak to this mystery. The way the body remembers what words forget. I know this truth not just from books, but from my own life. There have been times when no explanation could capture what was happening inside me. Words fell short, yet my body told the story anyway, through silence, through trembling, through meltdowns, through shutdowns. My nervous system carried echoes that language couldn't quite reach. So in this episode, we'll ask, why do words often fail trauma survivors? What does it mean that the body is its own language, one of sensation, posture, and movement? And how do we begin to listen when the body speaks in tremors, tears, or gut churns instead of sentences? We'll explore scientific theories, from neuroscience to somatic psychology. We'll hear alternative and even skeptical voices that challenge the dominant narrative. We'll step into personal reflections, including my own lived echoes of body memory, and we'll look at practices for bridging the gap between the silence of the body and the speech of the mind. This is a journey into the unspoken, into the trembling hand, the racing heart, the frozen tongue, into the knowledge the body carries when words vanish. When words fall short, one of the most common experiences of trauma survivors is this, not being able to put it into words. Sometimes it happens in therapy. A person sits across from a counselor, asked to describe what happened. They open their mouth and nothing comes out. Or they stumble through fragments, repeating "I don't know" or "I can't explain it." The silence frustrates them, sometimes even shames them. They think, "I should be able to say this. Why can't I?" But what neuroscience shows is that this isn't a personal failure. When trauma is triggered, parts of the brain involved in speech, especially Broca's area, go offline. The limbic system takes over. The amygdala, the ancient alarm system, floods the body with signals of danger. Cortisol and adrenaline surge. The nervous system moves into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. In that moment, language simply isn't available. In van der Kolk's studies, brain scans revealed that when survivors recalled traumatic events, Broca's area often showed decreased activity. In plain terms, the body could relive the terror, but the mouth couldn't narrate it. This is why people often say, "I don't remember in words. I remember in feelings." A sudden tightness in the chest, a wave of nausea, a headache that arrives out of nowhere. These are not metaphors. They are the memory itself, lived, not spoken. I remember times in my own life when words failed me. Moments of shutdown where I wanted to explain my distress, but literally could not. Times when my nervous system was already so overwhelmed that speech wasn't an option. People asked, "What's wrong?" But the question only amplified the pain, because the very part of me that needed to answer was offline. The silence wasn't chosen, it was imposed by biology. And yet, the body was speaking. Through stillness, through tears, through the tension in my shoulders. Through meltdowns that others misread as defiance, when really, they were the only language left available to me. The burden of silence when words fall short, survivors often feel isolated. We live in a culture that prizes language. If you can't explain it, it's as if it didn't happen. If you can't narrate it, others dismiss it. And if you try but falter, people may say, "You're exaggerating," or "You're making it up." This is another wound piled on top of the original trauma. Not only did something unbearable happen, but now the inability to speak is used as evidence against you. Silence becomes interpreted as guilt, shame, or weakness. I've lived this double wound. I've felt the sting of being invalidated because I couldn't articulate my pain on demand. I've seen how others interpret silence as stubbornness, or how they label shutdowns as avoidance. But what I know now is that silence in those moments wasn't avoidance at all. It was the nervous system doing its job. It was the body remembering in the only way it could. When words distort instead of fail, there's another side to this too. Sometimes survivors do find words, but those words don't match the truth of the experience. Trauma fragments memory. It distorts sequencing. It collapses time. A person may recount an event, but leave out crucial details, not because they're lying, but because the memory itself is stored differently. This creates openings for skeptics to challenge them. That doesn't add up. That timeline doesn't make sense. But again, this is not a failure. It's how the traumatized brain encodes. The hippocampus, responsible for sequencing memory, often falters under stress. The amygdala imprints sensations and emotions without chronology. So what emerges later is not a neat narrative, but a jagged mosaic. Philosopher Henry Bergson once suggested that memory is not a fixed record, but a living process, drawn into the present by need and emotion. Trauma proves him right. It is not that memory is broken. It is that memory is embodied, non-linear fluid, personal reflection. The times words couldn't hold me in my own life. I've seen how language sometimes betrayed me. There were moments when I did try to explain my distress to a parent, a teacher, a friend, and I found myself rambling, circling, stumbling, leaving out pieces that felt vital but unreachable. The frustration was immense. Inside me, the sensations were overwhelming, but outside, the words sounded confused, messy, incomplete. And then there were the opposite times, moments when no words came at all, when the build-up of pressure finally collapsed into silence, when my body held the entire story in tension, posture, or tears, but my mouth refused to participate. To others, it looked like stonewalling. To me, it felt like drowning with no ability to call for help. What I see now is that both were forms of body memory speaking. The rambling, the stumbling, the silence, all of it was communication. The problem wasn't me. The problem was a culture that assumes words are the only valid form of truth. The philosophy of silent silence, of course, has long been recognized in philosophy and spirituality as more than absence. In Buddhist practice, silence is honored as a space where truth arises beyond concepts. Mystical traditions often say that what is most real cannot be spoken. Even modern thinkers like Ludwig Wittgenstein argued, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. What trauma survivors live is not a mystical silence, but a biological one, and yet the overlap is striking. The deepest truths sometimes resist words, whether in meditation or in trauma recall. The body remembers what language cannot. When words fall short, it is not failure. It is not a weakness. It is biology. It is philosophy. It is the body stepping in where language falters. We'll now explore what happens when the body becomes the primary language of memory, how trembling hands, frozen postures, and gut churns are not symbols but memories themselves. We'll break down the scenario of returning to a childhood home and the step-by-step ways the nervous system relives the past without words. Because to heal, we don't need perfect sentences. We need to learn how to listen when the body speaks. Somatic memory, the language of the body. If words fall short, what takes their place? The answer is the body itself. Trauma lives not only in the mind, but in sensation, posture, and gesture. It is carried in the way hands tremble, voices catch, eyes dart away. Somatic memory is not metaphorical. It is not like memory, it is memory expressed in a different language. The science of somatic memory, Bessel van der Kolk's phrase. The body keeps the score captures this in a way that has resonated worldwide. But what does it mean in practice? In neuroscience, when a traumatic event occurs, the amygdala floods the system with alarm. The hippocampus, which usually sequences memory into past, present, and future, becomes disrupted. Prefrontal reasoning dims. The event is stored less like a neat story and more like a raw imprint, a surge of images, sounds, smells, muscle contractions, and visceral sensations. Later, when a trigger appears, a sound, a smell, a phrase, a place, the body reactivates the original imprint. The heart races, muscles tighten, palms sweat. The body has remembered even when the mind says, "This is years ago, I'm safe now." Peter Levine, the creator of somatic experiencing, argues that trauma is frozen survival energy. When fight or flight is impossible, the nervous system locks the unfinished action into the body. That incomplete charge remains stored until released, sometimes for decades. A shaking leg, trembling hands, or sudden collapse are not random. They are the nervous system attempting to complete the loop. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory adds another layer. He shows that the vagus nerve, connecting the brain to the heart, lungs, and gut, encodes trauma in patterns of autonomic reactivity. A raised voice may not only be heard in the ears but felt in the gut. A smell may bypass conscious recognition and directly trigger a freeze state. In this view, the body isn't reminding the mind of trauma. The body is the mind remembering. The scenario, trembling hands at a childhood home. Imagine this. You return, years later, to the house where you grew up. The walls are familiar. The rooms echo with memories both good and painful. You stand in the doorway, and suddenly your hands begin to shake. You're not cold. You're not ill. Nothing objectively dangerous is happening. But your body knows. Here's what occurs step by step. 1. Sensory input. The smell of old carpet, the creak of the floorboards, the angle of light through a window. These bypass ordinary perception and land directly in the limbic system. 2. Amygdala activation. The amygdala recognizes threat not through logic, but through association. The last time this combination of sensory input existed, pain followed. It fires alarms. 3. Autonomic shift. The sympathetic nervous system surges. Adrenaline courses. Cortisol rises. Heart rate increases. The body is preparing for danger. 4. Motor output. Muscles contract microscopically. Fine tremors emerge in the hands. This is survival energy seeking release. The body is ready to fight, flee, or collapse. 5. Conscious confusion. The prefrontal cortex tries to reason. This is just a house. It's fine. But the body resists. No, this is then. The discrepancy between body truth and mind narrative creates inner conflict. What looks like trembling hands is not weakness. It is memory. It is the body replaying a story in its own language, one written in nerves and muscles rather than words and sentences. Why somatic memory matters for trauma survivors. Understanding somatic memory changes everything. It reframes symptoms from pathology into meaning. A panic attack isn't irrational. It's a memory expressed in heartbeats and breathlessness. A flinch at sudden noise isn't oversensitivity. It's the body remembering danger. Dissociation, the blankness, the fog, isn't laziness. It's the nervous system's protective script. When we see the body as storyteller, the shame begins to lift. Survivors stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start recognizing, "My body is telling me what happened." Philosophy of embodied memory philosophers, too, have sensed this truth. Henry Bergson distinguished between habit memory, stored in the body through action, and pure memory, the conscious recall of events. Trauma collapses these categories. It is a habit memory intruding on present life, often without pure memory's clarity. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in Phenomenology, spoke of the lived body, not the body as an object, but as the very subject of experience. In this sense, trauma is not stored in the body like a filing cabinet. Trauma is the body's way of being in the world, altered, contracted, alert. Even spiritual traditions echo this idea. In yogic philosophy, impressions of past suffering, called samskaras, are said to be etched into the subtle body. They shape reactions long after the mind has forgotten. Healing is about releasing these imprints, allowing energy to flow freely again. Personal reflection. My body's language, I've known trembling hands. I felt the stomach churn, the sudden dizziness, the throat close without warning. For years I judged these as failures. I thought, why can't I just be calm? Why can't I just explain myself like everyone else? But over time, I began to see them differently. These weren't malfunctions, they were communications. My body was remembering experiences that my conscious mind had minimized, dismissed, or buried. For instance, there were places I returned to that stirred reactions I didn't understand. Rooms where I went quiet, conversations where my voice caught. At first I blamed myself. Later I realized these were the echoes of past experiences. My nervous system was whispering, "This is familiar. This is not safe." Even when my rational mind tried to insist everything was fine, the body told the truer story. Learning to listen changed everything. Instead of fighting the tremors, I began to acknowledge them. Instead of denying the shutdown, I learned to name it. And in that space, healing began, not because the body stopped remembering, but because I stopped ignoring its language. The limits of somatic memory. Of course, somatic memory is not perfect. The body remembers, but it can also generalize. A slammed door may trigger a startle, even if no harm follows. A smell may spark panic without a clear cause. Critics of van der Kolk warn against taking every bodily sensation as proof of trauma history. Elizabeth Loftus's work on memory reminds us that recall, whether verbal or somatic, is reconstructive, not photographic. The body may misfire, confusing similar contexts. But to dismiss body memory because it is imperfect misses the point. All memory is imperfect. What matters is meaning. The trembling hands at the childhood home may not recall one specific moment, but an accumulation, years of unsafety, neglect, or fear. The body compresses them into a single response. What emerges is not detail but essence. Somatic memory is the body's language. Trembling, sweating, flinching, freezing. These are not symbols pointing elsewhere. They are the memory itself. The body speaks what words cannot. In the next part, we'll widen the lens. While van der Kolk's work has shaped much of the conversation, it's not the only perspective. We'll look at alternative theories, skeptical voices, and even spiritual traditions that challenge or complement the idea that the body keeps the score. Because truth is rarely captured by one theory alone. The body remembers, yes, but how we interpret that remembrance matters. Beyond Bessel, alternative perspectives Bessel van der Kolk's "The Body Keeps the Score" has become something of a cultural landmark. It's quoted by therapists, shared on social media, and sits on the shelves of countless people searching for answers about trauma. His central claim, that trauma is stored not just in the mind but in the body, resonates because it explains what survivors have long felt but struggled to articulate. But van der Kolk's work is not the final word. It is one interpretation of a vast and complex reality, and if we stop at his framework alone, we risk flattening the diversity of human experience into a single story. Trauma is too varied, too layered, too entangled with culture, philosophy, and spirit to be captured by one man's theory. So in this part, we turn outward, to alternative voices, to critical perspectives, to philosophies that challenge or deepen the picture. Because if the body remembers what words forgets, then surely we need many languages, scientific, cultural, and spiritual, to truly listen. Neuroscience and the skeptics. Not everyone agrees with van der Kolk's framing. Some neuroscientists caution that saying the body stores trauma risks a misleading metaphor. After all, memory is not literally stored in muscles or organs. It is encoded in neural networks distributed across the brain, spinal cord, and autonomic pathways. Critics argue that the phrase "the body keeps the score" can give the impression of memory as a kind of frozen photograph hidden in the tissues, but neuroscience suggests something subtler. Trauma is not a file waiting to be opened, but a pattern of activation. When triggers appear, networks fire, recreating the state. What is remembered is not an image, but a state of being. This distinction matters. If we think trauma is literally stored in the body, we may look for release as though flushing out a toxin. But if trauma is a pattern of nervous system activation, healing may be less about extraction and more about retraining, teaching the body new pathways. Elizabeth Loftus, and the fragility of memory psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, is famous and controversial for her work on false memories. She has shown, through decades of research, that memory is reconstructive. People can be led to recall events that never happened. Details shift with time, suggestion, and context. Applied to trauma, Loftus's work is often used by skeptics to challenge the reliability of both verbal and somatic recall. If a trembling hand or a flashback emerges decades later, how can we be sure it is accurate? Might the body be generalizing or even misfiring? This is uncomfortable territory. Survivors bristle, understandably, at the implication that their memories could be false. But Loftus's research reminds us of something important. Memory is not a courtroom transcript. It is alive, flexible, and deeply entwined with meaning. From one angle, this fragility undermines certainty. From another, it shows that what matters is not precision but truth in essence. A trembling hand at a childhood home may not recall a single incident, but an atmosphere, 1,000 subtle reinforcements of fear or neglect. The body condenses them into a signal. The truth lies not in detail but in the reality of impact. Phenomenology, the body as subject, philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty invite us to go further. In his view, the body is not an object that stores memory, but the very subject through which experience happens. Trauma, then, is not inside the body like a parasite. Trauma is the way the body inhabits the world after suffering. This shifts the frame. Instead of asking, where is the trauma stored, we ask, how does trauma alter the body's being in the world? Survivors may find that the world feels narrower, heavier, more threatening. Space itself seems charged, time collapses. Attention narrows. This isn't storage, but transformation. From this angle, somatic memory is not about recall, but about presence. The body doesn't replay a past event like a tape. The body carries forward a new way of existing, hypervigilant, contracted, reactive. Healing, then, is not erasing memory but expanding being, slowly reopening what trauma closed. Eastern and mystical traditions. Long before neuroscience, spiritual traditions spoke of impressions left in the body. In Hindu and Buddhist thought, samskaras are subtle imprints left by past actions and experiences, carried into habit and reaction. These are not just psychological but embodied. A person who suffered fear may flinch reflexively, not because of conscious thought, but because the imprint lives in their subtle body. In yoga, trauma might be seen as a knot in the flow of energy. In Buddhism, it might be part of the cycle of samsara, the endless return of suffering until awareness breaks the loop. In mystical Christianity, trauma could be compared to wounds of the soul, carried in silence until grace or compassion opens them to healing. These traditions don't describe trauma in modern scientific terms, but they converge on the same truth. Experience embeds itself in more than words. The body, whether flesh or subtle, remembers. Cultural perspectives, collective somatic memory. In many indigenous cultures, memory is not just individual but collective. The land, the community, and the ancestors are seen as carrying trauma together. When one person trembles, it is not only their own story but the echo of generations. Take, for example, the concept of chosen trauma described by psychoanalyst Vamik Volkan. Entire groups can identify with an ancestral wound, a war, a massacre, a betrayal, and carry it forward as identity. This is more than narrative. It shapes posture, ritual, and collective behavior. A community may embody vigilance, mistrust, or sorrow across centuries. From this angle, van der Kolk's focus on individual somatic memory is too narrow. The body keeps the score, yes, but so does the collective body, the shared nervous system of a people. Healing, therefore, may require not only personal therapy, but collective rituals, storytelling, and justice, personal reflection, beyond the labels. When I received my late diagnosis, ADHD, and bipolar type 2, I thought the labels might explain everything. Perhaps they would help others understand why I struggled. Perhaps they would give me a sense of belonging. But as time passed, I realized the labels themselves were not enough. They gave names, but they did not touch the lived truth, the way my body carried memory. What I've learned through my own journey is that the body doesn't care much for diagnostic categories. My shutdowns, meltdowns, mistrust, and shutdown silences were not symptoms of a label. They were my nervous system remembering. They were imprints of past overwhelm, past invalidation, past trauma. I share this because van der Kolk's theory, while helpful, is not complete. My healing has come not only from recognizing the body's scorekeeping, but from weaving many threads. Somatic awareness, philosophy, spirituality, skeptical reflection, and above all, compassion for myself. why multiple perspectives matter. The danger of any single theory, whether van der Kolk's, Loftus's, or Merleau-Ponty's, is that it becomes a new dogma. Survivors can end up trying to fit their experience into a framework that doesn't quite match, feeling once again unseen. But if we gather perspectives, neuroscience, philosophy, spirituality, and culture, we gain a richer picture. The body remembers, yes, but it remembers as state, as presence, as imprint, as collective echo. No one language captures it all. This is why conversations matter, why philosophy sits alongside neuroscience, why spirituality stands with psychology. Together, they reveal that trauma memory is not a single phenomenon, but a chorus, sometimes discordant, sometimes harmonious, of ways the past lives on. Beyond van der Kolk, we find a landscape of perspectives. Some critique, some compliment, some expand. Together, they remind us that the body's remembrance is complex, layered, and irreducible to one theory. In the next part, we'll narrow in again, exploring what happens when trauma returns not as images or stories, but as feelings alone. Emotional flashbacks without words or pictures, just despair, rage, or terror emerging in the middle of ordinary life. Because sometimes the body doesn't replay a scene. It simply replays the fear itself, or emotional flashbacks without words. Sometimes trauma returns not as pictures, not as stories, not even as fragments of narrative, but as raw, unmediated feeling, no image, no sequence, just sudden despair in the middle of an ordinary day, just rage erupting during a calm conversation, just terror while standing in a familiar, safe place. This is the realm of emotional flashbacks, those moments when the body remembers without words, without images, without context. What are emotional flashbacks? Unlike visual flashbacks, which replay scenes in vivid detail, emotional flashbacks are pure state shifts. A person is suddenly back in the emotions of trauma without knowing why. Pete Walker, who has written extensively on complex PTSD, describes them as time-traveling emotions. One moment you're grounded in the present, the next you're drowning in the despair, fear, or fury of decades ago. Neurobiologically, this happens because the amygdala fires as if the original threat were present, while the hippocampus fails to supply the past tense marker. The prefrontal cortex, which might normally contextualize, this happened then, not now, is hijacked. A result, the body relives the feeling as if it's happening now. These episodes are often misunderstood. Without images or words to explain them, they can appear like mood swings, overreactions, or inexplicable volatility. But in truth, they are the body's purest form of remembering. Scenario, rage in ordinary conversation. Imagine sitting in a cafe with a friend. The conversation is light, meandering about work, the news, and daily frustrations. Then your friend uses a tone that, to them, seems harmless, a clipped phrase, a dismissive shrug. Suddenly, something surges inside you. Your chest tightens, heat rises. You feel rage, hot, uncontrollable, terrifying. You snap back sharply or shut down entirely, shocking both yourself and your friend. This wasn't about the conversation. The tone struck a deeper chord. Somewhere in your history, a dismissive shrug or a clipped voice carried danger. Maybe it signaled rejection. Maybe it signaled abuse. Maybe it meant your needs didn't matter. The body stored that association. Now, decades later, in an entirely different context, the nervous system fires the same pattern. What looks like an overreaction is really a perfect reaction, perfect to a past context, but misplaced in the present. Why words fail here, emotional flashbacks are notoriously difficult to explain, even to ourselves. Without images or narrative, there's nothing to tell. When someone asks, "What's wrong?" the survivor may answer truthfully, "I don't know," because consciously they don't. The body knows, but words forget. This can leave survivors feeling crazy. Why am I so angry? Why am I so sad? Nothing's happening. Self-doubt creeps in, compounded by others' dismissal. But what neuroscience shows us is that the amygdala does not need a picture to react. It only needs a cue. Tone of voice, smell, posture, and energy in the room all can trigger pure emotion. The cost of misunderstanding. For many of us, these flashbacks were punished. As children, when anger erupted seemingly out of nowhere, we were scolded. When despair took hold without reason, we were told to cheer up or stop sulking. When fear paralyzed us in ordinary settings, we were labeled weak or shy. This misunderstanding deepens the wound. Not only does the body carry the original trauma, but the secondary trauma of invalidation compounds it. Survivors learn to mistrust their own feelings, to suppress their truth, to perform calmness while the storm rages inside. Personal reflection, my own emotional flashbacks, I know this intimately. For me, anger rarely came from nowhere. It was the product of a long build-up, of needs ignored, of repeated dismissal. By the time the flash of rage appeared, it was never random. It was the last straw, but to others it looked sudden, disproportionate. These were emotional flashbacks. My body was reliving the helplessness of being ignored, invalidated, and silenced as a child. My nervous system said, "This is happening again. You are not safe." And so the response was big, because the remembered feeling was big. What made it harder was not knowing why at the time. I'd sit afterwards, bewildered, asking myself, why did I react like that? What's wrong with me? Only later, through self-reflection and study, did I realize these were loops of trauma playing out in my body without words. Recognizing them as memory, as the body remembering, changed everything. Instead of shame, I began to meet them with curiosity. Instead of suppression, I began to breathe, to name the sensation. This is a flashback. This is old. And that naming created space to choose differently. The philosophy of feeling without image philosophically, emotional flashbacks raise a fascinating question. Is memory always about content, or can it be about state? Henri Bergson argued that memory is not just a record but a tendency, the body leaning into the past to shape the present. Trauma proves him right. Emotional flashbacks show memory as pure tendency, pure effect, without detail. In Buddhism, feelings without image might be described as vasanas, latent tendencies carried forward. They are not thoughts but energetic imprints, surfacing when conditions align. The task is not to repress them, but to meet them with awareness, seeing them as echoes rather than commands. Even psychoanalysis touched on this with Freud's idea of repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to relive past emotions in new settings. Emotional flashbacks are the nervous system's raw enactment of this compulsion. Healing emotional flashbacks. So how do we work with something that has no words? Therapists like Pete Walker suggest several steps. 1. Recognition. Naming it as a flashback can break the spell. Saying internally, this is old, this is a memory, helps the prefrontal cortex re-engage. 2. Grounding. Orienting to the present through the senses, naming objects in the room, feeling feet on the ground, and slowing the breath. 3. Compassion. Instead of judging the feeling, meet it like a child. Of course you feel this. You've been here before. 4. Expression. Sometimes movement, sound, or writing helps the energy discharge safely. For me, body journaling became key. Writing not just what I thought, but what I felt in the body, tight chest, trembling hands, heat in the face. Over time, patterns emerged. The body's language slowly became legible. Emotional flashbacks remind us that trauma is not always about pictures or stories. Sometimes it is pure emotion, raw, overwhelming, inexplicable. But far from being irrational, these feelings are the body's most faithful memory. They are the score the body keeps when words and images fall away. We'll now look outward again, looking at the cultural and collective dimensions of somatic memory. Because it's not only individuals who tremble, rage, or despair without words. Entire communities, even nations, can carry trauma in silence, embodied across generations. So far, we've been looking at trauma as an individual experience, the trembling hands, the racing heart, the emotional flashback that arises in the middle of a cafe. But trauma does not belong only to individuals. Just as the nervous system of one body keeps the score, so too can the nervous system of a community. Memory is carried not only in brains and muscles, but in rituals, in posture, in silence, in the collective body of a people. The idea of collective trauma psychoanalyst Vamik Volkan coined the term chosen trauma to describe how entire groups identify with an ancestral wound. A massacre, a betrayal, a war, something that cut deeply into the collective psyche, becomes not only history but identity. Think of communities that still live in the shadow of colonization, or nations that commemorate past defeats with rituals of sorrow, or families who, generations later, still carry the fear of famine or displacement in their traditions and habits. These are not just stories retold. They are embodied memories. Collective trauma shows itself in how groups walk, speak, and relate. It shapes posture and expectation. A person may carry vigilance, mistrust, or grief as a baseline state. This is trauma remembered not in one body, but in thousands. Examples of cultural memory 1. Slavery and the African diaspora. The legacy of slavery did not end with abolition. It lingers in generational hypervigilance, in communal mistrust of institutions, in embodied knowledge that the world may not be safe. This memory surfaces in art, in music like the blues and spirituals, songs that carry pain too deep for words alone. 2. The Holocaust. Survivors passed on more than stories. Studies have shown changes in stress hormone regulation in the children of survivors, suggesting trauma is carried biologically as well as narratively. Families sometimes avoided certain foods, sounds, or conversations, embodied echoes of past horrors. 3. Indigenous communities. Many indigenous peoples describe land itself as carrying memory. Colonization, forced removals, and cultural erasure are not only remembered in stories, but in collective rituals, dances, and ceremonies that seek to heal wounds too vast for language. 4. Political and cultural divides. In more everyday terms, think of societies replaying old political wounds. Civil wars, revolutions, betrayals, the memory doesn't vanish. It resurfaces in group suspicion, in sudden eruptions of violence, in the inability to trust certain leaders or neighbors. The physiology of collective memory. Can communities really embody memory? In one sense, yes. Social neuroscience shows that mirror neurons and synchrony play a powerful role in group behavior. When one person trembles, others in the group often feel an echo of it. When crowds chant, sing, or march together, their nervous systems literally synchronize, heart rates and breathing patterns aligning. This synchrony can be healing, as in rituals, protests, or religious gatherings, but it can also replay trauma. In a crowd whipped into fear or hatred, individuals may feel carried by forces larger than themselves. Their nervous systems resonate not only with their own past, but with the collective body of the group. Silence as collective memory. Sometimes the most powerful form of collective trauma is silence. Families that never speak of the war, communities where an atrocity is known but never named. The silence itself becomes the memory, carried in posture, in avoidance, in the tension of subjects never discussed. Children grow up sensing this silence. They may not know the story, but they feel the weight. Their bodies absorb the atmosphere of fear, shame, or grief. This is what family systems theorists call intergenerational transmission, the passing on of trauma not through explicit teaching but through tone, silence, and embodied habit. Philosophy of collective memory philosophers like Paul Ricoeur have written about memory not only as individual recall, but as collective narrative. Memory is constructed, retold, and reshaped by groups. But when groups cannot or will not tell the story, the memory does not disappear. It goes underground into the body. Here trauma becomes what Nietzsche called the eternal return, suffering replayed across generations. Unless broken, the loop continues. A nation traumatized by betrayal may forever expect betrayal. A family wounded by abuse may unconsciously recreate abuse. These loops are cultural as well as personal. Ritual as healing language. If trauma is remembered in the body, then healing also requires the body. For communities, this often takes the form of ritual, commemoration, memorial services, vigils, anniversaries. These are not just words, but embodied acts of standing together, of holding silence, of lighting candles. The body remembers together, dance and music. Many cultures use song and movement to process grief. The blues, gospel, and indigenous dances are body words, speaking what language alone cannot. Protest and solidarity. Marches, sit-ins, collective chants, these synchronize bodies in defiance, transforming private pain into public strength. These rituals are not mere performance. There are ways the collective body processes what words cannot carry. Personal reflection, feeling the collective weight. In my own journey, I felt this collective weight. There have been moments when I entered spaces, political rallies, religious gatherings, even family events, and sensed an atmosphere heavier than the words being spoken. My body tensed, my gut churned without a clear personal reason. Later, I realized I was picking up on collective memory. I recall as a child, a second cousin of mine died in a car accident when I was very young, I think, 5 or 6 years of age. I was considered too young to attend the funeral by my family, and I didn't know my second cousin very well, but I recall the weight and memory of the day very well. I still have visual images in my mind, although fading to this day. 40 years later, I've never forgotten the feeling, the grief and trauma of my loved ones and what I felt for, and knew of them. Some of this came through mirror neurons, my nervous system resonating with the bodies around me. Some came from unspoken silences, generations of family avoidance or cultural shame, and some perhaps was more mysterious, the land itself, the atmosphere of history pressing in. These experiences reminded me that my trauma was not only mine. My body carried echoes of others. My healing, then, was not only for me but for those I touched, and even for those who came before me. The shadow side of collective memory. Of course, collective trauma can also be weaponized. Politicians may invoke old wounds to stir fear and control populations. Narratives of victimhood can be manipulated into justification for violence. Collective memory becomes not healing but poison when it is used to divide. We see this in propaganda that constantly replays past humiliations, keeping wounds open. We see it in movements that demand loyalty by invoking ancestral suffering. The body remembers, but memory can be exploited as well as healed. Why this matters for survivors. For individual survivors, understanding collective trauma can be liberating. It helps explain why certain struggles feel larger than personal. The despair or rage is not only yours, it may be the echo of generations. Recognizing this can shift the weight from shame to compassion, both for yourself and for those who came before. At the same time, awareness of collective trauma highlights the need for community-based healing. Personal therapy is powerful, but some wounds require group rituals, solidarity, and justice movements. The body heals best when it is mirrored not only in one safe relationship, but in a safe community. The body remembers not only individually, but collectively. Families, communities, and nations carry trauma in silence, ritual, posture, synchrony. Healing, too, must be collective, not just words, but bodies moving, mourning, and rising together. Now we'll return inward, exploring personal reflections, my own lived echoes of body memory, times when my body remembered what my mind tried to forget, and how recognizing this truth reshaped my healing. Because while theory and culture matter, the deepest truth often lies in the simple, undeniable reality of one trembling hand. Personal reflections, my own echoes theories, neuroscience, and cultural perspectives matter. They give shape to what so many of us feel but can't explain. But there is another language, quieter and often more compelling, the language of lived experience. My own story, like many of yours, has been shaped by moments where my body remembered what my mind could not. The first realization, the body knows before I do, for much of my life, I thought I was simply different. I felt too much, thought too deeply, reacted too strongly. Others told me I was overreacting, too sensitive and difficult. When I shut down, I was called distant. When I raged, I was called nasty and horrible. When I froze, I was labeled uncooperative. But inside, what I felt was not choice. It was compulsion. It was the nervous system speaking louder than my words. And because no one else seemed to recognize it, I doubted myself. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was the problem. The first cracks in that self-doubt came when I noticed how often my body responded before I did. I'd enter a room and feel my stomach churn before I knew why. I'd meet someone and feel tension in my chest even as I smiled politely. Later, I'd discover those instincts were right. The person was manipulative, the room was charged, the situation was unsafe. My body remembered patterns long before my conscious mind caught up. Diagnosis and the labels that didn't quite fit. Years later, when I sought help, I was given labels: autism, ADHD, and bipolar type 2. At first, these seemed like answers. They explained why I felt different, why I struggled with regulation, and why I didn't respond like others. They gave me some validation, especially since they came from both the NHS and a private assessment during my psychology studies. But as time passed, the labels began to feel insufficient. They explained the symptoms, but not the root. They pathologized what to me felt like adaptations. My shutdowns, meltdowns, and heightened sensitivities weren't simply disorders. They were the body remembering, responding, protecting. Trauma and environment had shaped my nervous system. The labels pointed to patterns, but the truth was deeper. This realization didn't erase the diagnoses. It reframed them. They became descriptions, not definitions. They helped explain struggles, but didn't capture my essence. My body's memories, the flashes of rage, the shutdown silences, the physical sensations, held more truth than the diagnostic words ever could. Moments of sudden echo. One of the clearest examples came when I revisited places from my childhood. I'd step into a room, hear the creak of a door, smell the damp air, and suddenly my body would shift. My throat would tighten. My hands would tremble. My legs felt heavy, as if bracing for something unseen. No specific image came. No story played in my mind. Just the sensation, unsafe. At first, I dismissed it as imagination. But the more I studied trauma, the more I realized this was my body remembering. Not in words, not in pictures, but in state. These moments taught me to trust the language of my body. They also showed me how long I had doubted it. For years, I had silenced these signals, forcing myself to stay calm, to stay rational, to stay normal. But ignoring the body never made it stop. It only made the symptoms stronger. Anger, the uninvited guest anger, has always been the most misunderstood part of my memory. To others, it looked like defiance, disrespect, loss of control. But for me, it was survival. Anger rarely erupted suddenly. It built slowly after layers of dismissal, invalidation, or neglect. Each ignored need was like pressure building in a sealed container. By the time I reacted, it wasn't about one moment. It was about years of being unheard. When anger came, it wasn't just emotion. It was body memory. My chest burned, my face flushed, my voice rose without conscious decision. It felt as if my body had taken over, pulling me back into the helplessness of childhood when I couldn't get through to those around me. What changed over time was my relationship to this anger. Instead of condemning it, I began to see it as my body's way of saying, enough. Anger was not rebellion. It was communication, a reminder of boundaries crossed, of dignity denied. In that light, it became less shameful and more instructive. Shutdowns and the silence that speaks on the other side were the shutdowns. Times when I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't explain. Others saw these as stubbornness or avoidance. But inside, they were collapsing. My nervous system had shifted into freeze, conserving energy, shielding me from further overwhelm. In those silences, I often wished I could explain, but words never came. My body had taken me offline, retreating into a space beyond language. Looking back, I see these shutdowns as memories too, echoes of times when speaking up brought punishment, when silence was the only safe option. Even today, I sometimes fall into that space. The difference now is awareness. Instead of forcing myself to perform, I allow the shutdown to signal what my body is holding. And often, that compassion shortens its duration. The spiritual layer. As my journey deepened, spirituality brought new language. What science calls trauma, some traditions call karmic imprints, samskaras, or shadow energy. The idea that suffering leaves residue in the soul as well as the body resonated deeply with me. During meditation, I felt memories surface not as stories but as sensations: heat in the chest, heaviness in the gut, sudden tears. These moments felt like cleansing, like the body releasing what words had never captured. In those times, I realized healing wasn't only psychological. It was also spiritual, a process of allowing energy to move, of reconnecting with love and compassion. The mirror effect. Another discovery was how my healing influenced others. Through mirror neurons, our nervous systems resonate with those around us. When I carried unprocessed trauma, those close to me felt my tension, my mistrust, my volatility. When I began to heal, to calm, to ground, to extend compassion to myself, those around me shifted too. I saw this in relationships. When I softened, others softened. When I set boundaries with clarity rather than rage, others responded with more respect. Healing wasn't only for me. It rippled outward, helping to rewire the nervous systems of those I connected with. This realization gave me strength. It reminded me that my work was never selfish. Every time I chose to listen to my body rather than suppress it, I created space for others to do the same. Why reflection matters. Telling these stories matters not just for me, but for all survivors. Trauma thrives in silence, in isolation, in the belief that no one else feels this way. By sharing, I break the illusion of isolation. I also reclaim authority over my narrative. But more than words, reflection matters because it bridges the gap between body and mind. My hands may tremble, my chest may tighten, but when I put those sensations into a story, I integrate them. The body speaks and the mind listens. Together, they begin to heal. These echoes, the trembling hands, the shutdown silences, the bursts of anger, the sudden dread, are my body's language. For years, I ignored them, judged them, or fought them. Now, I see them as memories. They are the body remembering what words forgot. Let's now look at practice. If the body keeps the score, how do we learn to read it? How can we tune into somatic memory not as a disruption, but as a guide? We'll explore practical methods for hearing the body's language, from grounding and breathwork to art and ritual. Because listening to the body is not just about awareness. It is the doorway to healing. Practices to hear the body's language. If the body remembers what words forget, then healing requires us to learn a new kind of listening. Not the kind of listening we do in conversation, but listening through sensation, breath, posture, rhythm. It's the skill of becoming fluent in the body's language, a language written in tightness, trembling, stillness, heat, and breath. This isn't always easy. Many of us were trained to ignore or override our bodies. We were told to sit still, to stop fidgeting, to calm down. We were taught that logic and words mattered more than feelings and instincts. To listen to the body now can feel foreign, even threatening, but it's also profoundly liberating. Because once we begin to hear what the body has been saying all along, we reclaim the wisdom that trauma tried to bury. Grounding, teaching the nervous system. Now grounding is perhaps the most fundamental practice. When trauma memories pull us into the past, grounding anchors us in the present. One method is orienting, gently scanning the environment, naming what we see, hear, and feel. I see the blue chair. I hear the hum of the fridge. I feel my feet on the floor. This simple practice recruits the prefrontal cortex, reminding the nervous system that we are not in danger now. Another is breath grounding, slowing the exhale, extending it longer than the inhale. This engages the vagus nerve, shifting the body from sympathetic arousal into parasympathetic calm. I've used grounding countless times. When flashbacks or waves of rage surged, grounding was the bridge between the body's memory and the reality of the present. It didn't erase the feeling, but it helped me contain it, to remind myself. This is old, this is memory. Body journaling, translating sensation into words. One of the most transformative tools for me has been body journaling. Unlike regular journaling, which captures thoughts and events, body journaling captures sensations. You write what you feel in your body, moment by moment. Tightness in chest, heat in face, numbness in legs. Over time, patterns emerge. You notice that certain people or places always produce certain sensations. You learn the body's language through repetition. This practice builds a bridge. The sensations that once felt overwhelming or meaningless gain coherence. Words return, but not as an intellectual explanation, as a translation of the body's truth. Movement and somatic discharge trauma often traps energy in the body. Shaking, trembling, pacing, or other spontaneous movements are the nervous system's way of discharging what was frozen. Animals do this instinctively. A deer that escapes a predator trembles violently before resuming life. Humans, however, are often taught to suppress these releases. Practices like shaking therapy, dance, or simply allowing the body to move freely can help restore this natural discharge. I've found that when I allow myself to move, even just pacing or stretching when overwhelmed, the intensity of emotion lessens. It's not dramatic, it's ordinary, but it works because it honors what the body is trying to do. Creative expression, art, music, ritual words may fail, but creativity often succeeds. Art, music, and ritual are languages of the body that bypass the need for literal explanation. Art. Drawing sensations, painting colors of emotion, sculpting shapes of memory, these allow expression beyond words. Survivors often find their drawings reveal what they didn't consciously know. Music. Playing or listening to music that resonates with the body's state can unlock emotions safely. The blues, drumming, or even humming can shift nervous system states. Ritual. Lighting a candle, creating a personal ceremony, or repeating a symbolic act can give the body a sense of closure or honor. For me, creativity has been less about producing something beautiful and more about giving my body permission to speak in its own dialect. Safe relationships, co-regulation as medicine. The nervous system is social. Trauma often occurs in a relationship, and so healing also requires a relationship. Safe people become anchors. Their steady breath, calm tone, and compassionate presence allow our nervous systems to relearn safety. This is why therapy works, not just because of techniques, but because of the relationship. The therapist's nervous system co-regulates with the client's. The same is true of friends, partners, or groups that truly listen. In my own journey, I've noticed how certain people calm me simply by being themselves. Their presence says you are safe. That's not a metaphor, it's physiology. Their regulated nervous system signals mine to stand down. Spiritual practices, listening beyond the body. For some, healing practices extend beyond psychology into spirituality. Meditation, prayer, yoga, or breathwork can open pathways where body and spirit meet. During meditation, I've often felt old sensations surface: heaviness, tears, sudden warmth. At first, I thought I was doing it wrong. Later, I realized this was the body processing memory, letting it move. In spiritual traditions, this might be seen as purification or the release of karmic imprints. In scientific terms, it is integration. These practices reminded me that listening to the body is not just about reducing symptoms. It is about reconnecting with something larger, with love, with spirit, with meaning. Why practices matter. Practices aren't about erasing trauma. They're about giving the body what it never had: safety, expression, compassion. Each time we ground, journal, move, create, connect, or meditate, we send the body a new message. Now is not then. Over time, this repetition rewires the nervous system. The flashbacks may not vanish, but their grip weakens. The body still remembers, but it remembers differently. Memory becomes less a prison and more a guide. Practices to hear the body's language are not luxuries. They are essential tools for survival, for integration, for healing. The body speaks constantly. The question is whether we listen. In the next part, we'll explore how words and body can come together. Because while the body remembers what words forget, true healing often requires weaving them back together, finding language that honors sensation and stories that grow from embodied truth. Integration, words and body together. If trauma teaches us that words fail, healing shows us that words can return not as control, but as companions. The task is not to abandon language, but to integrate it with the body's memory, to bring sensation and speech back into dialogue, to create a space where trembling hands and stumbling words can coexist, where story grows not from suppression, but from embodiment. Why words alone fail. We've already seen why words falter in trauma. The brain's language centers often go offline during overwhelming experiences. Survivors may feel mute, unable to describe what is happening. Later, when they try, words feel flat or wrong. Language, so precise for daily life, seems blunt and inadequate for describing terror or despair. But abandoning words altogether isn't the answer. Words matter. They allow us to share, to connect, to be witnessed. Without them, trauma can remain trapped in the private body. What's needed is not a rejection of words, but a new relationship between words and the body. The dance between body and speech integration is like a dance. The body leads, words follow. First comes sensation: tight chest, trembling hands, tears. Then slowly language comes to meet it. I feel fear. This is anger. My body remembers. The words don't erase the sensation. They acknowledge it. Therapists often call this dual awareness, being with the body while also narrating it. The narration doesn't take over, but gently holds the body's truth. Over time, this strengthens the connection between the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, allowing regulation. I've found this in my own life. When I began to name sensations, not interpret them, just name them, something shifted. My chest is tight. My hands are shaking. Speaking these simple truths out loud softened their grip. It was as if my body finally heard, no longer had to shout. The role of witnessing integration is not only internal, it requires being heard. When another person listens, really listens, to both words and body, something profound happens. The shame of trauma lifts. The memory that once felt isolating becomes shared. This is why group therapy, support groups, or safe friendships matter so deeply. When I spoke my sensations and someone nodded, stayed present, and said, "I hear you," my nervous system relaxed in ways no solo practice ever could. Words and body met in the space between us, witnessed and validated. Narrative therapy and reauthoring. Some therapeutic approaches, like narrative therapy, emphasize reauthoring the story. Survivors are invited to tell their experiences in new ways, highlighting resilience rather than only victimhood. But for this to work, the body must be part of the process. Otherwise, the story becomes intellectual rather than embodied. When I combined narrative therapy with somatic awareness, it changed everything. My story wasn't just words on a page. It was words that grew from sensations, words that aligned with trembling and breath. The story felt true, not fabricated. It gave me ownership of my past without denying its impact. Spiritual and philosophical dimensions of integration. Philosophically, integration echoes ancient traditions. In many cultures, words were seen as sacred when aligned with truth. Speech divorced from embodiment was considered hollow. In Christianity, the Word made flesh symbolizes ultimate integration, spirit and matter, language and body, united. In Buddhism, mindful speech is speech rooted in awareness of body and breath. In indigenous traditions, storytelling is not just words, but embodied performance, gesture, and rhythm. All these traditions remind us that words gain power when rooted in the body. Trauma separates them. Healing brings them back together. Personal reflections. Learning to speak again for me. Integration has meant learning to speak openly again, but differently. As a child, I often couldn't speak at all in moments of overwhelm. Later, I spoke in anger, my words sharp and uncontrolled. Neither felt like a true voice. Now I try to let the body lead. When my chest tightens, I pause. I name it, I breathe, only then do I speak. The words that come may be slower, softer, but they carry more weight because they are aligned with sensation. This has changed my relationships. Instead of exploding or shutting down, I can say, I feel tense right now, or I'm not going to continue this right now. My body is remembering something. These words don't erase the feeling, but they open space for connection. They let others in. Practices for integration 1. Speak sensation, not interpretation. Instead of saying, I'm anxious, try, my chest is tight. My breath is shallow. This keeps words close to the body, grounded in fact rather than judgment. 2. Slow storytelling. When telling your story, pause often. Check the body. Notice sensations. Let the pace match your nervous system rather than forcing fluency. 3. Use creative language. Metaphors, images, and poetry often capture what literal words cannot. It feels like a stone in my stomach may express more truth than I'm nervous. 4. Find safe witnesses. Share with people who can hold both your words and your body's truth. Avoid those who rush to fix or interpret. 5. Integrate across time. Practice saying, that was then, this is now. Use words to mark time, helping the body separate past from present. The risk of over-intellectualization. One danger is swinging too far into words, using them to avoid the body. Intellectualizing trauma, analyzing, theorizing, and debating can feel safe, but keep us disconnected. I've done this myself, burying pain under layers of analysis. It felt clever, but my body still carried the weight. Integration means balance. Words are used not to escape, but to articulate. The body leads, words support. Without the body, words are hollow. Without words, the body is isolated. Together, they create wholeness. Why this matters for healing. Integration matters because it restores coherence. Trauma fragments, body in one place, words in another. Healing unites. When words and body align, we feel more whole, more authentic. Our stories become not only believable to others, but believable to ourselves. This wholeness ripples outward. In relationships, integrated speech creates intimacy. In communities, embodied storytelling fosters solidarity. In culture, integration challenges the dominance of detached rationality, reminding us that truth is not only in logic but in lived sensation. The body remembers what words forget, but healing is not about abandoning words. It is about weaving them back into the body's memory, creating a language that honors both trembling and truth. Integration is not the end of trauma, but the beginning of a new conversation, one where body and words speak together at last. Final thoughts. We've traveled a long way in this episode, from the limits of language to the body's fluent truth. From trembling hands and wordless flashbacks to practices that help sensation and speech move together again. If there's one takeaway, it's this: your body is not betraying you, it is remembering for you. When we meet those memories with compassion, they become guides rather than prisons. Before we close, take a breath, feel your feet on the ground. Next, we're stepping into a difficult, essential subject, episode 16, trauma bonding and the body's betrayal. We'll unpack why abuse survivors feel pulled back toward abusers, how dopamine, oxytocin, and intermittent reinforcement entangle love with danger, and why a person can feel in love after cruelty, only to crash into shame. We'll break down the neurochemical loop that makes the bond feel irresistible and map concrete ways to interrupt it in the body, not just the mind. Until then, you've been listening to The Body Knows. Thank you for listening. Thank you for walking this path with me. I hope this episode offered not just insight but compassion for yourself, for others, and for the child within who still longs to be seen. James Miller.